Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 219 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris.
We're going to start off with a thank you.
Yeah, a big thank you to Dee, who is our new Patreon supporter.
We really appreciate having you, Dee. Thanks so much. And we also do get some renewals, and we appreciate you as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who's been doing that. It's great. Because reminder, you can do the monthly option or you can do the annual option.
And we really appreciate your support. We also have a thanks to Robin, who's a long-time listener. Hi, Robin. We met you many years ago at Booktopia. After the last episode, we got a great email from Robin saying that when she was listening to the episode, up popped on her Audible format, she listens to audiobooks, that there's actually an audio version of the Decameron Project, which is what I talked about when I was speaking about the short stories that I read during the last episode. And the Decameron Project was sponsored by the New York Times, where they asked, I think it was 29 authors at the height of the pandemic, July of 2020, to write about their experience. And I read two of them and they were fantastic. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. That is definitely free and something you can listen to if you're interested in listening to all or some of them through your earbuds.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin, for that. We also wanted to clarify a title that was mentioned in our interview with Laura Toma. I don't remember who said it. It may have been me, but we are talking about wonderful, bad romance movies for queer folks. And the title that we meant to say was Single All the Way. And I think we said Jingle All the Way. Two very different movies. Single All the Way is really charming about two gay guys.
And Jingle All the Way is with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sinbad. Very different movie.
Very different. So highly recommend.
And this time, as opposed to episode 218, where we buried the lead, we're going to tell you right away the cue for Read Along.
Yes, we announced that last episode. Our fourth quarter read along in our year of reading romance is A Little Bit Country by Brian D. Kennedy.
We're really excited about this book. It's a YA novel. This was his debut, and it looks like something that's very feel-good, which was something we were aiming for the fourth quarter.
Yeah, it's heartwarming, feel-good kind of story. It's also a queer story, young adults, two guys. I think it's kind of like an enemies to lovers situation. The author I read also wrote it as a tribute to Dolly Parton. Some of the action takes place at a place very much like Dollywood. So country music is a theme.
We're all in.
Yeah.
If you're interested in joining the Zoom conversation, that'll take place on December 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's a Sunday. And we also do have a thread available on Goodreads if you want to join the discussion there anytime.
Anytime. It's not a square on our bingo card to read a romance by a male writer, is it? I don't think
so, but we're flexible.
Yeah.
But Q4 is the square on the bingo card.
Q4 is a square, and then a lot of these other categories will cover some of those squares too if you're participating in that.
Yeah. So, Chris, what are you currently reading? I'm
still into Armadale by Wilkie Collins. I am loving it. I have been reading for about an hour every morning. That's the first thing I do when I wake up, just to get my pages in. And I think I'm on track to finish it October 30th. And this is my book for Victober, I should say. That's why I do want to finish it within October. It's just a fabulous story. It's one that I didn't know anything about, and I didn't read anything about it. Because with classics, I do not read the introductions until after I finish the book, because so often those introductions have tons of spoilers. But more to come. I'll talk about the plot and all that good stuff after I finish it.
I'm reading The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. This is a really cute premise. It's a romance, and Florence Day is our protagonist, and she's a ghostwriter for a very well-known romance novelist. She's on serious deadline, like tomorrow. The current book she's working on is due, and she's having trouble finishing it because she went through a terrible breakup, and so writing an HEA, a happily ever after, is hard for her to think about or conceptualize of. So she goes and has a meeting with the editor, trying to convince them that she should write a different kind of book. And they're like, yeah, no, we want you to write a romance for this famous romance novelist. She's also someone who sees ghosts, it just so happens, or as she refers to it, those working through a post-living experience.
God, I love that.
It was hilarious. For reasons which I do not want to spoil, she is living in New York City, but she gets called back to her hometown, where she is infamous for being a teenager who helped a ghost solve their murder. So it's one of those things where when she grew up and was of age, she was thrilled to fly the coop and leave, and she hasn't really been back for 10 years, and now here she is back. It's a good story. I think the premise is fantastic. She goes back to the small town. Her family owns the local funeral parlor. So, you know, ghosts may be in abundance, obviously, which gives you some insight to her background and how she was talking to ghosts. I'm really enjoying it. There's some laugh out loud things, like there's a cat named Dolly Purton, which I thought was very cute. There's a couple things that I've been questioning. And one of them is, if you're a ghost writer, that's different than being a co-writer.
Yeah.
I think back to when we talked to the author Chris Tebbets, and he was a co-writer with James Patterson, and he was telling us James Patterson outlines the books. He has a very clear idea of what he wants the book to be, and then your job as a co-writer is to help write it.
Yeah, and sometimes like writers take turns writing chapters or whatever. I think there's a lot of different ways to co-write.
And ghostwriters, in my mind, I think of it more as sometimes a famous person wants to write a book, but they're not a writer, so they hire a ghostwriter. And that person doesn't appear on the cover, and it isn't really their job to be out in the open. So it seems a little odd to me that a famous novelist would use a ghostwriter, and then if the ghostwriter is having a hard time, you know, has writer's block or essentially is stuck on the ending, it seems to me that they might call the writer and say, hey, let's work through this, you know? So that part of the book seems a little bit odd to me, but whatever. Yeah. I don't know the rules. And then there's just been a few things writing wise where I'm like, I don't know. But the story is so compelling. I'm really enjoying it. I did notice on Goodreads it has vastly different ratings. I'm enjoying it though, and recommend it so far. The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston.
Well, what a coincidence, because I am reading a book right now that has a character who can see ghosts as well. It is not a humorous book though. It is a horror, supernatural type novel. It's This Cursed House by Del Sandine. It's a story about a woman. She's an African-American woman. It's the 1960s. She's in Chicago. Her life is completely blown up. And she gets a letter from a family in New Orleans, just outside, saying that they wanted to hire her as a tutor. And so she's like, well, I have nothing else going on, and I need to take care of myself. So she takes a train from Chicago to New Orleans, 1960s, gets down there, and people ask like, oh, where are you going? What are you doing? And she's like, I'm going to work for this family. And people immediately clam up, and they're like, oh, interesting. So she starts working for this family who are very light-skinned Black people, and they're very elitist. And you find out as the story goes along that they cannot leave the house because of a curse. And I don't want to say anything more because it's the unfolding that's really awesome. I'm about 70% through. This is one I'm reading on my e-reader. So I'm reading it at night, and I've stayed up a little bit too late a couple nights, but really enjoying this one. I saw a lot of pre-publication buzz, so I'm really happy to report that so far it is panning out. Yeah, so this one just came out early October. More to come.
Sounds creepy.
And that is This Cursed House by Del Sandine.
I'm also reading another romance novel, two at the same time. And this happened because I'm reading this one via my ears and paper. It's called Birding with Benefits by Sarah T. Dubb. It's narrated by Mia Hutchinson-Shaw and Evan Sibley. This is one that we had considered for the Q4 read-along because it is a debut and a romance. And it's a later in life romance. So Celeste is 2 years post-divorce. Her daughter's about a year out of flying the coop to go to college. And Celeste decides that she's going to say yes to everything that comes her way. She has posted that on her mirror. Things like skydiving, for example. But the start of the novel, she has said yes to going on a fake date with a guy named John who's trying to make his ex jealous. Right away, that setup is kind of to me. I don't really like stuff like that. But the novel goes back and forth between John and Celeste's point of view. It uses a male narrator and a female narrator. I like that it's a later in life second chance romance. And I like the birding part. The reason it's called Birding with Benefits is because she goes on this fake date and then it turns out that he is participating in a birding challenge called the Bird Binge, where you try to find as many birds as you can. So once that part starts, the chapters have Bird Binge, day 19 of 42, bird count 67. So each of the chapter headings tells you where they are in that. I was thinking about you, Chris, because the reason this book isn't quite working for me has to do with the words, particularly when it comes to sex and how they're talking about sex. So I've really been thinking about, we're planning towards the end of this year to talk about what we've learned about romance. And I think a turnoff for me, or maybe it's not even a turnoff because I don't feel like it's being prudish and like it turns me off sexually. I just feel like it takes me out of the story more, is when they're like, he pounded her up against the closet door. Like, that doesn't really sound pleasant to me. I don't want to think about that. So I think sometimes that's the thing with this story that I'm finding troublesome. And she also drops the F-bomb a lot, which you and I are both fans of the F-bomb, but for some reason it's taking me out of the story a little bit. So, and it is a debut. And I also have to say that I started reading this one as soon as I finished Louise Erdrich's novel, which is her 40th novel or something. So the comparison might not be quite fair to then pick up a debut novelist. You know.
And it's audio
and the paper, but I'm mostly listening to the audio.
So is it a case of where like the narrator isn't good at dropping the F-bomb? Because I think some people, the F word sounds natural to them. And other people, when they say it, you can tell they don't usually say it.
Right. And they have to gird their loins to get it out. Yeah.
Or is it something along those lines? Or is this just not flowing even in the text?
I'll have to pay attention to that. I mean, I think sometimes it's kind of wordplay. So like when she meets this guy, John, and she finds out he works in wood, she's like, oh, wood, you know? And I'm like, okay, maybe it's juvenile. I don't know. More to come, you know, like I'm halfway through it. So when I finish it, I'll try to have my feelings about it more succinct.
Right.
But again, it's called Birding with Benefits by Sarah T. Dubb. It has a very cute cover as well, and I am enjoying that, again, that it's a later in life romance.
Emily and I don't talk about the books we're going to talk about. We don't set them up in any particular order or anything like that. So the fact that you're reading a book with a woman who can see ghosts, I'm reading a book with a woman who can see ghosts, you're reading a book that's a romance with fake dating. The next book that I'm currently reading, which is the audiobook I'm listening to, is all about fake dating.
Oh my gracious.
Isn't that bizarre how that happens? Gosh. So the book is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. I am in love with this audiobook. Absolutely in love. And I can thank Sigrid for it because we had our buddy read conversation about A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens last week. And afterwards, we were just talking about books in general. And this one came up as one she really recommended, and specifically the audiobook. So when I started listening to it, at first, I didn't like it. I didn't like the voices. And it's narrated, performed, I think is a great, more of a descriptive thing, by Joe Jameson. I don't know when things change, but I am loving his performance. He does all the voices, and they're British voices and accents. Amazing. I hate to have to get to work and shut the car off and stop listening.
Oh, I love that feeling so much.
So I've been listening to it a lot, really loving this story. It is about a guy who is the son of C-list performers who were really popular, like in the 80s, a husband and wife who broke up when the boy was really young. So he never knew his father, never really met his father, who was a pop star. Both of his parents were in the music industry. And his dad is now revitalizing his career. Even before the dad started revitalizing his career, he would end up in the tabloids because even though his parents are C-list and he's E-list, as somebody says, the tabloids are still following him and taking unfortunate photos and things like that. He works in a nonprofit for dung beetles.
So random.
It is so friggin' funny. The first time beetles come up, I thought, oh, the Beatles, like the music Beatles, right? No, it's the dung beetle. So it's a nonprofit trying to save the dung beetle. Very conservative people donate to this. He's like, it's really hard to convince people to give their money to a bug that deals in shit when there's all these other glamorous nonprofits you can donate to, right? Last straws, he's gay, conservative organization, conservative donors. There's a photo of him taken that's not attractive, and they're losing donors. So the boss calls him in and says he needs to make himself to be a more respectable homosexual. The premise is he needs to find a boyfriend, a fake boyfriend, to help raise his status a bit so that the donors will come back and see that he's respectable. It's really funny. I haven't listened to an audiobook or read a book with the word homosexual in it in a long time and laughed so much.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really funny. You just get such a sense for the characters, and then the fake boyfriend as well is absolutely charming. And of course, you know what happens with fake dating.
Right.
So,
yeah. And is it a romance?
It's a romance, yes. And this author, Alexis Hall, I thought that it was a man at first, but they don't reveal their gender, and I don't really know who they are. Like, there's no photos or anything, and on their website and social media, their pronouns are he, she, they, or whatever. They live a very private life. They have a full-time job that they love, and they're not needing to be in the limelight, but they've written a lot of books, and this one is just a delight so far. So, yeah, the dung beetle nonprofit thing is just really funny.
Yeah.
And there's another character that he works with who is very posh and part of the upper crust who is really funny. I don't usually find characters that are so brainless to be funny, but really funny. More to come on that. Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. If you decide to do the audio, give it a little bit of time and you may fall in love with it as well.
Sometimes I find that when I watch TV shows that have British accents, I usually watch with the closed caption. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I think it just takes a little while to get those accents where your brain can follow it well.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's that. I think it was just, well, it was also the circumstances maybe. I didn't appreciate the voices. And I'm listening to it at regular speed. That's a really wonderful thing.
Yeah.
It's not one that I feel the need to speed up, put it that way. So, Emily, what have you just read?
Well, I went back to The Mighty Red by Louise Erdrich. This book just came out at the beginning of October. Like I said, I think it's her 40th book or some such. She has been around for a while writing. Let's just say that. It's an interesting structure. It's a novel, and it is structured in, I believe, 3 parts all around a wedding. So part 1 is the proposal, and then part 2 is vows, etc. And then I think it goes to part 4, which is the after marriage or something like that. So that was a surprise to me, and it admittedly took me a little while to figure out that was the structure because I paid attention. I went back and looked through the book because I am reading an ARC. If you get the printed copy, I wonder if there might be a table of contents or something. But anyway, it's about a woman named Crystal Frechette, and she is delivering sugar beets from the farm where they are grown to the warehouse where they then make sugar beets into sugar, which was something I learned about. I didn't even know that a lot of the sugar we get in this country comes from sugar beets. I thought it came from sugar cane. What do I know? And someone proposes marriage to her daughter. And her daughter says yes, but she's actually in love with somebody else. There's reasons that her daughter says yes that I do not want to spoil. But what this novel is largely about is farming and why beet farmers treat their farmland the way that they do and the impact it has environmentally, both to the ground and also to the people around those chemicals that they're using on the beets, and also the history of farming. And one of the characters that I found really poignant in this novel is married to a man whose family bought her original family farm. So she's back there living on the farm, but they're treating the farm much differently than the family who originally farmed it did, using more natural processes, etc. Farm culture in the United States is very complicated. We have something called a farm bill that is very political and has to do with how crops are financed and help or don't help farmers plant their crops. So she's definitely touching on that in this novel, but the way she's doing it is through telling story about the people living on the land. There's also a mystery that takes place, and I don't mean to say that for you mystery readers. It's not like a whodunit mystery, but there's something that happened with these teenagers, with Crystal's daughter and her peers, that you don't really understand at the beginning of the novel and then comes out as the novel progresses. So that kept me turning the pages. She's just a great writer. And I did listen to an interview with her, and she said, people have said to me, I wrote a book about farming, and I don't know anything about farming, which I thought was really funny because she did write a book about farming. But also she's trying to tell a story about native lands and how our lands have been used differently over the course of history. Highly recommend. It's out now. Again, it's called The Mighty Red by Louise Erdrich.
It made me think a little bit about The Seed Keeper.
Yes.
A novel we read for our year of Indigenous reading.
Yeah, by Diane Wilson. That's a beautiful novel. And also, talks about the complexity of farming.
So I listened to a romance of the horror subgenre. It's called If I Stopped Haunting You by Colby Wilkins. It just came out October 15th. It's narrated by two actors, Curtis Michael Holland and Kyla Garcia. And this is another enemies to lover book. And what attracted me to it is that it's set in a haunted castle in Scotland during a writer's retreat. So
that's what I love about Dead Romantics. The premise is really just smart.
Right, exactly. So the opening scene, Penelope and Neil are the two main love interests, and they're both Native American horror writers. The opening scene is they're at a conference. They're on the panel, right? So they're sitting in front of the audience, and they start having an argument. He is the Prince of Horror, is what he's called. Very popular, very successful. And Penelope's book, she's published one book 5 years ago, had some really good critical acclaim, but it was not popular. And she feels like he's a sellout. They have this big argument in public, ending up with her throwing the book at his head. Yes. And so fast forward 4 months later, they have a mutual friend who has arranged this writer's retreat at a haunted castle in Scotland. Neither one of them knows the other is coming. And then there's a fourth author. So it's 4 authors. It's a private writer's retreat. At first, I thought it was like a big conference kind of thing, but it's for these writer friends. And you were saying about the one that you were listening to, it feels a little uneven. Same with this. I have to say I didn't particularly like or enjoy any of the characters, and I'm not the kind of person who needs to like the characters to get into a story, but I need to at least care about them. What I cared about was the plot and seeing how things would unfold and get resolved. So that's what kept me listening. The dual narrators didn't really work for me. I have found that sometimes when there's dual narrators, they really create a different understanding in my mind of the character. The characters might sound angrier than I think they are, or less angry, or not startled by something. I don't know. It's a fine line, I think, with dual narrators.
That's making me wonder if that's part of, with Birding with Benefits, if that's what it is, because it's the same. It's the two different narrators.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I wonder, like, are they in the same room at the same time doing the recording, or is it something that gets edited together? Who knows? I don't know. Not that it was horrible. I'm not saying that at all. I definitely sped it up, though. Like I said, the writing felt a little uneven to me. It's a debut. That's totally a non-issue for me. I understand that. Some of the fascinating things that the writer does, though, is she talks about politics of being a Native American writer in the publishing industry, and how, like, there's only room for one rock star at a time. There can only be one Native American horror writer who's the prince of horror at that moment in time. And also how they're pitted against one another. So Neil and Penelope's last names begin with the same last letter, and so they're shelved next to one another. So there's even that proximity of competition on the shelf, right? Interesting story. I know it will drive some people insane that the narrators say Edinburgh. So be warned about that. There's some rotting corpse. It's not like they're describing the worms coming in and out or anything like that, but it is scary. It's a horror novel with romantic elements. There's sex happening, and sometimes it's a bit ridiculous. Like, there's one scene, and only the two of them can see these ghosts that are in the castle. The other two writers are clueless. They don't see anything. There's one scene where they just saw something horrible and they're afraid, and the guy's like, let's fuck. You know, like, it just... I don't know, like, it just...
Do they bang up against a door?
They're doing it all over the place. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a prude at all, but one thing I'm learning is that I do like things left to the imagination.
I like foreplay. So to me, it's like, oh, there's a dead body. Let's fuck would not work very well for me. I mean, unless I find that sexy, I guess, a dead body with worms coming out of it.
Well, there is the whole affirmation of life thing that happens
true.
when something awful happens and you end up having sex. You should, like, affirm that you're alive and everything. So there is that. The writer has another book coming out early next year. I already have an advanced reader copy of that. I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, I really enjoyed the plot. It went in some directions that I didn't see. So overall, really enjoyable. It just may not be everyone's cup of tea. And again, that's If I Stopped Haunting You by Colby Wilkins.
Wow, we're just having a lot of interesting back and forth dynamic. I finished a book that I too think won't be for everyone, but I think is going to be in my top 10 for the year. And it's called Sandwich by Catherine Newman. OMG. I loved this book so much. I've already sent it to a friend, so I don't have it with me. This is the one, I think on one of our BookTube videos, I talked about it. It was blurbed by Ann Patchett. Essentially, her blurb was, you'll either be crying or laughing. And that's exactly how I felt. There's a prologue, and then there are sections for each day of the week. And it starts on a Saturday, and they are renting a cottage in Cape Cod for a week that they go back to every year for 20 years. They've done it. So it's taking you through the course of their vacation week, essentially, this novel. And Rocky is the main protagonist. Her husband is Nick, and they have two kids, Willa and Jamie, who are grown-ups, and their cat, Chicken, who all come to this cottage. Rocky is 54. She is in full-on menopause. She spends the week overheating and reminiscing about the past 20 years that they've come to this cottage, including times, you know, with her kids, and also times where she had some problems with pregnancies. And that's where some of the poignancy comes in. Some of those scenes about menopause and just she and her husband of many years just getting older, I laughed harder than I have laughed in a novel in so long. I mean, I was even trying to read some passages to the Gentleman Caller, and I could not get through them. I was laughing so hard. I love her writing so much. It's just hilarious. But then some of the poignant parts were also where she juxtaposes those beginning years of being a mother and just having babies already and being pregnant and trying to juggle all of that versus now where she and her husband are empty nesters, you know, so just putting the dichotomy of those experiences. And there's a point where she's referring to how she feels about her adult children that I could really relate to. You don't get to see them as often as you want, and you want to just eat them almost, which sounds so weird. But there was a point where she said that, and I was like, yes, that's exactly how I feel. Oh my goodness. When I start reading a novel, I always try to throw it onto Goodreads, but not see what people are saying, especially friends, unless I'm not sure if I want to, read a book. Once I finish this and, put that I'd finished it in Goodreads, I saw what some people were saying, and it's either you really like it or you don't like it. I think what most people had a hard time with was the way that the mother, Rocky, communicated with her children. It seemed like she didn't have very good boundaries. That's not how I felt about it, but I could totally see where you may feel that way. And I think some of that might have to do with what the age of your children are currently when you're reading the book, and also how you communicate with your own parents as an adult, and also understanding that you have different relationships with your parents and with your children depending on personality. So I thought the author actually did a really good job with that. I do want to say that the title Sandwich, I was like, what the heck does that mean? So I was really trying to pay attention as I read it. And as happens when you're on a vacation with family, there's lots of sandwich making every day because they go to the beach. And then there's also a period of the week where her parents come. And so it's that sandwich generation. You've got the older parents and then your kids. And then I believe it took place in the town of Sandwich on Cape Cod, which is the oldest town in the Cape. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I could totally become a fangirl of Catherine Newman, the author, because I just feel like, I love your writing. I love you. I want to, stalk you. So I did do a little stalking of her after I read it. So again, it's called Sandwich. It's a small, quick read by Catherine Newman.
Nice. I read some picture books, and this is one I read before we went to the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art, The Tower of Life, How Yaffa Eliach Rebuilt Her Town in Stories and Photographs. This is by Chana Stiefel, illustrated by Susan Gall. This is one that was on display at work that I grabbed when I was just showing a student how to do the self-checkout thing. And I had it in my hands and I was like, I really like that cover. And then I started flipping through it and I really liked the illustrations a lot. Very bold colors. It's a story based on a very sad story of a village that was decimated during World War II. A Jewish village. The Nazis came in and basically murdered everyone. But Yaffa and her parents were able to escape, and they pretty much hid out during the war. Sadly, I don't think her grandmother survived. Her grandmother was a photographer, and I'm showing Emily here. This is a picture of Yaffa when she's a little girl, surrounded by her chickens there. This is in a village that had been Poland at the time. I think the borders have changed, and it's in a different country now, technically. But there are all these photos that her grandmother had taken, and her grandfather, too, I believe, of people in the town. She was actually a portrait photographer and then did candid photos for the family here and there. Yaffa grows up. She eventually comes to the United States. She gets a PhD. She created a fantastic exhibit at the Holocaust Museum with all of these photos.
It's amazing that the photos were saved.
Yes, a lot of them. She reached out to a lot of survivors and asked them for their photos if they were willing to share their story and share their photos. I mean, this book, it's a tough book. It's a picture book, but it's obviously dealing with a horrific situation. And the drawings of the awful things, the murders that happened and how the village was destroyed were really dark and bleak. And then how the family hid out. All of this is pictured, and the illustration style took me back to the 60s. But then at the end of the book, there are resources for adults to help their younger readers read more and give them more context, including a documentary called There Once Was a Town. It was a PBS documentary narrated by Ed Asner, and I started watching it. It's on pause right now, but very good, about Yaffa going back to the village for the first time as an older woman, taking her child and granddaughter back to the village to meet people and to find the people who murdered her grandmother, who turned out to be other Polish citizens of that town. Very complicated situation, which the book didn't go into. So I know I'm talking about this one a lot, but I highly recommend it. I think it's a really good book to talk about the Holocaust with younger people, but it also gives you a sense of hope and just the amazing resiliency of the human spirit, that somebody could survive what they went through and succeed in building a beautiful life and family. So again, that was How Yaffa Eliach Rebuilt Her Town in Stories and Photographs by Chana Stiefel and illustrated by Susan Gall. Now, that was a heavy book, a beautiful book. While we were at the Eric Carle Picture Book Museum, or Museum of Picture Book Art is the official title, I read some books when we were there, and I just want to give a quick rundown of them because I really enjoyed all of them. The first was The City Tree by Shira Boss, illustrated by Lorena Alvarez. It caught my eye because as a city kid, we didn't have a ton of trees in our neighborhood, so the ones that we did have were special. There are many more trees now in Chicago in general than there were back in the 60s. But this is a story of a young girl. There's a tree planted in front of her apartment building and what that tree comes to mean to the community. Really wonderful story. And the struggle to take care of the tree because not everybody respects trees. And then I read I Am Bat by Morg Hood. She is the author and illustrator of this one. It's about a little bat. Somebody takes his cherries, and they were his favorite food, and he's grumpy. So I can relate.
I can totally relate.
Yes.
Hands off my cherries.
Yes. So they come along and help him, so it has a happy ending. And then this was a charming little book, The Little Ghost Who Was a Quilt, by Riel Nason, illustrated by Byron Eggenschwiler. Such a charming story about this little ghost who was a quilt. His family, all his friends are sheets. So they're flying around, zipping everywhere. And this poor little quilt is like, oh my God, it's so heavy and hard to move around. I just can't do as much. And one day at the park, a little girl drips something on him, ice cream, I think it is, and ends up going home with the family and having a really wonderful time. Happy ending on that one as well. But I was just so charmed by the illustration and just the concept. I thought, what a creative idea.
People are so creative.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
And then the last one, this was one I read in the bookstore. They have a wonderful bookstore there. More to come on that. She Made a Monster, How Mary Shelley Created Frankenstein by Lynn Fulton, illustrated by Felicita Sala. And this is nonfiction. And I should say these are all picture books that I'm talking about. And this caught my eye for obvious reasons. The cover is a drawing of a woman with a quill pen. It's like, oh, I have to look at that. A really wonderful telling of how Mary Shelley came to write Frankenstein, which is a really famous story. And I appreciated it so much. And I kind of regretted not buying it because I thought, oh, that would be so cool to have like on display. But then I thought, well, no. I said in my really brief little Goodreads review, the silver lining is that hopefully some kid is taking it home and will enjoy it for years to come and eventually read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really wonderful books. I just love picture books. They teach us so much or reinforce lessons we know. I think they're good for the soul, really. I think more adults should read picture books.
Yeah, and I think one could feel like, and I'm using air quotes, easy to write a picture book, but it's really hard and it's time consuming. And if you're not the illustrator, figuring out the way that the story is also told through the pictures as well as the words, it's a whole mixture of work that goes into picture books that's very different than writing a novel.
Yeah. And there's some from my own childhood, they're so embedded in my mind that I can picture them. I can feel what it felt like to hold them because they were so important to me.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I read 2 short stories in my continuing short story project, and in the spirit of the Nobel Prizes, which were awarded last week, and in literature, Han Kang was the winner. She's a South Korean writer, Many of you might recognize the title The Vegetarian, which was one of her more well-known novels. I read 2 Nobel Prize winners. The first is Nadine Gordimer, who won the Nobel in 1991. Chris, I believe I got a copy of this book when we went to the Book Barn in Niantic the very first time, which was years ago now. It's called Loot and Other Stories. And I decided to just go ahead and read the title story, which is Loot. It's really cute. Chris has taught me now that I've done more used bookstore shopping with her to look through the book before you buy it, which I didn't do. And this, I believe, was a student's because there's tons and tons of pencil writing in here, which I actually found to be sweet. Loot is about an earthquake that takes place. And the very opening paragraph is, this was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded since the time of them recording earthquakes using the Richter scale. Lots of times an earthquake will cause like a big flood or a tsunami. This one caused the opposite, where the water receded. And then what happens is people come into the ocean bed, essentially, and start looting, start taking these things that are buried below the sea or below water. People rush to take stuff, and it's a moral tale about greed, I believe. It's very short. I want to say it's like 6 pages or something. Nadine Gordimer wrote the novel The Pickup. If you're looking for a book club book, I highly recommend that novel. I read it with my book club years ago and loved it. So I will be returning to this collection to read something else.
Oh, that's so cool, because I tried to read a novel by her years ago in the 90s, and I just could not get into it. It must have been after she won the Nobel Prize, right? Because she was so hot.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, let me try this. And I just couldn't get into it, and I felt really bad about that at the time. So maybe I'll try a short story. I didn't even know she wrote short stories.
Yeah, she has 2 collections, I think. You're welcome to borrow this.
Thank you.
And then the other one is from a collection that Aunt Ellen gave me that she found at the Friends of the Berkeley Library bookstore. And this is the Best Short Stories 2022, the O. Henry Prize winners, edited by Valeria Luiselli. I read her book, Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, which was a very small work of nonfiction about her experience helping immigrants on the border. And she wrote this thing in her introduction that I just thought I'd read really quickly about the short story. Perhaps no other genre encapsulates the general sensibility of a society in a particular moment in time as much as the short story. The short story is like a slice of the immediate present. Novels, because they are usually long-term commitments, may encapsulate the ethos of an era. The short story, the temperature of a moment. And this moment, as these 20 stories will hopefully show, is a moment in which we are beginning to open the doors and windows of this old locked-down house, letting new light and air come in to stir us powerfully into movement. So 2022 would mean that these stories were written in the height of the pandemic. And I decided to read a story by Olga Tokarczuk.
Oh, cool.
Who longtime listeners might remember when our read-alongs were books in translation. We read her book,
Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead.
Such a good book. At the back of this collection, each author tells you about their story. And so her story is called Seams, S-E-A-M-S. When asked what inspired the story, she says, I believe that the short story is the most perfect and the most demanding form of prose. It requires focus and precision. The idea for this story came to me suddenly and right away in a finished form after visiting an elderly man who was trying to cope with life after the death of his wife. This visit touched me a lot, and the only way to express my emotions was to find a literary form for them. So it's about an elderly man who has lost his wife. He's a widow, and he goes to his sock drawer to get a pair of socks out and notices that they have seams going up the back of them and finds that really odd. Why would my socks have seams? And then he goes to the grocery store and he asks about it, and the grocery store clerk's like, of course, if your sock didn't have seams, your sock would unravel. And then he starts to notice other things like the postage stamps aren't square anymore. Now they're round. I'm not sure I quite got the story. It's one of those where I'm like, I think there's more here than I understand, but I enjoyed reading it. That's about all I have to say about that. So the one thing I will say about the O. Henry Prize is they originally were only for Americans. And then they opened them up to, I think, people who had American citizenship. And now, 2022, these are people who don't have American citizenship. And the one I read was translated, and I should say by Jenny Croft, who I know some of you know her as a translator. So fun. 2 Nobel Prize winners, 2 very different stories.
It sounds really great.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to hear that it was opened up to people who are not Americans. Usually that goes the other way, because I remember when the Booker, they opened up that to Americans, that caused quite the stir. And people were like, oh my God, is there anything that Americans can't stay out of?
Right. No.
Oh, God. Sorry, everyone. Oh my gosh. So, Biblio Adventures.
Woo, woo. We got in the car and we went north.
We did. But first, we want to thank our listeners. We had a couple listeners write in sharing their Biblio Adventures. Mary had a fantastic Midwest Biblio Adventure. She ended up at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which is one of my favorite libraries. Such a cool place. And then she also was in 2 bookstores. I believe it was 2 bookstores in Wisconsin. Mary visited Mystery to Me bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin. And then she also went to Arcadia bookstore in Spring Green and sent us pictures. They look like fantastic bookstores. So, Mary, thank you for sharing those with us.
Such a delight. We love getting email with Biblio Adventures.
Yeah, and she even put like the websites in the email so we could just click and learn more about the bookstores and the library. And then we also heard from Barb, who let us know that Moby Dick is chasing her these days.
Look out behind you.
Yes. She said she's going to have to cave and read it someday soon. But she was visiting her son, and they ended up at the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University. And there was a really wonderful display about children's literature there and a cool pop-up book on Moby Dick.
Yeah, which is amazing. I mean, most pop-up books that I owned with my kids ended up getting, well-loved. So it was really cool to see the picture she sent that it was a really beautiful copy of it. I love pop-up books.
I do too. Although I have an awful memory of fighting over one with a cousin and we ripped it. And it's just like, oh, well, that was really smart.
Right. Some of our lessons are harder than others.
Yes. Well, so as Emily started saying, we hopped in the car and had a fantastic drive heading north up into Massachusetts.
Yes, our first stop, as we've mentioned and alluded to already, was the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art in Amherst, Mass. It's a very cool, modern building. Right away when we walked in, there's an auditorium where they were showing a film about Eric Carle, so we started there.
Yeah, a half-hour film about his life and showing him doing his work in his studio, how he creates the collages and paints them and cuts things out and puts it all together.
By the end of it, it was also talking about the museum. And when you walk down the main hallway of the museum, there are these huge pieces that he did. And it actually showed him creating them. Like he uses a broom and all sorts of equipment to do it.
Yeah, as Emily said, it's a very modern looking building. It's white, all angles. It's square and boxy. But on the inside, there's so much natural light. And that hallway that Emily was just mentioning with those works, one whole side of it practically is glass, looking out into this wonderful courtyard with benches and
an apple orchard. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just beautiful. So when we came out of the auditorium, then there's a different hallway than what we're referring to that has a walk down memory lane with important dates in Carle's life and these long rectangular pieces that show all of his books from the very beginning. And one thing that really surprised me, Chris, is I have just been reading to my grandbaby Nina, Brown Bear, What Do You See? And I always thought that it was written by Eric Carle, but it's not. That was the first book that he ever illustrated, but it was written by somebody else.
Yeah.
So they did start the timeline there, but then The Very Hungry Caterpillar was published in 1969, and I think is still his most famous book that he wrote.
Yeah.
And it was going to be called The Willy Worm or something like that.
It was at first a worm. The character was a worm, and his editor said, a worm is not going to go over all that well. And it was a big fat worm.
Yeah.
Like the worm starts off kind of scrawny, I think, and ends up fat. Mm-hmm. And the editor didn't think that was going to fly.
Right. And then it ended up being a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly. Much different idea. And there was a wonderful exhibit about his 50-year relationship with his editor, Anne Benedus. I was mistaken. I thought certainly that's a permanent exhibit, but it's not. It's one of the temporary exhibits.
Yeah, they have 2 big galleries, and both of them are rotating, and they're going to be switching them out again, I think, in January, February. Mm-hmm. They have a wonderful schedule that you can see on their website about what's there now, what's coming up. Wonderful space. Yeah. And they're joint on the inside. You don't have to go in and out necessarily.
Yeah.
And then they also have a library, a reading library, where you can go in and hang out. They have comfy seating in there. You can sit on the floor. It's carpeted and cozy.
Which is where Chris read a lot of those children's books she just talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really nice.
And they had a special section devoted to Caldecott honorees, which was really cool as well.
Yeah.
And then we did save it for last, but a beautiful bookstore / gift shop.
Yeah. Really fantastic. Tons of books for all ages, which was surprising and nice to see.
Mm-hmm. And not just Eric Carle books. I mean, the museum really celebrates picture book writers and artists. Mm-hmm. So that part was really nice to see. I did buy a copy of, I think it's called Pancakes in paperback. That is an Eric Carle book for both of my kids because I've made a metric shit ton of pancakes in my lifetime, and I thought they would both enjoy that book.
That's nice. And I picked up a copy of Moomin Valley in November by Tove Jansson.
And you're new to the Moomin Valley universe.
I am new to the Moomins. I hadn't heard of them until a few months ago when a friend in Wales was having a Moomin-themed wedding. And I'm like, what is a Moomin? So that set me off learning about the Moomins. When I was at Amherst, at the Amherst bookstore, I saw a Moomin display because I guess there's a biography coming out on Tove that is helping to increase her worldwide appeal in some ways, or Moomin Renaissance. But I was on a video call with Sean and 2 other guys, one from Canada, one from Australia, and I asked them, Sean Breed's books, I should say, I was like, do you guys know the Moomins? And they're all like, oh yeah, love the Moomins. You're in for a good time with the Moomins. And James is actually like, oh, look, from Australia. He's like, oh, look, I'm actually drinking my tea out of a Moomin mug at that moment in time. So they are really huge internationally. And I have a lot of catching up to do. I'm told they're good for the soul kind of books. There's a comic strip, there's board books, and then what I have is like a middle school, I think is what we'd call it here in the U.S., middle school type chapter book.
And then when we were done with the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art, we hopped in the car, our bellies were grumbling, and we hightailed it to the Montague Book Mill, which is a fantastic used bookstore right on a river in a really cool old mill. And they have a cafe, Lady Killigrew Cafe. So we started there with a snack.
Oh, yeah. Really yummy food. The last time we've been to Montague Book Mill before, a couple years ago, and it was a really rainy fall day, which is great. But I mean, the place was really packed. We think because of that, because, people needed a place to come in from the rain. This time it wasn't quite as packed, but still a lot of people in there browsing and eating.
Yeah, I think you were looking for something. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I did leave with The 10th Muse by Judith Jones, which I believe you found for me, didn't you?
Yeah, I saw it on a shelf and I squealed.
Yes. That's her memoir. When we were talking to Sarah Franklin about Judith Jones, that's a book that came up. And then The Collected Stories of Shirley Hazard is a big book of her short stories, which I'm excited. I've never read her, so I think that'll be a nice entry.
Yeah, very cool. I haven't read her either, so I'm looking forward to hearing about your experience. I bought 3 things. You know, you're there. It's on the spot. And their prices are really very decent. I picked up a copy of A New Home, Who'll Follow by Caroline Kirkland. This is a memoir from the 1830s of a woman who was homesteading in Michigan in the 1830s. And I read parts of it or the whole thing way back in the 1990s. And I thought it would be good to refresh my memory and or read it for the first time, who knows, before I read Margaret Fuller next year. Her Summer on the Lakes in 1843 or 2, I don't remember. Then I also bought a copy of Thinking and Writing About Literature by Michael Mayer. It looked good to me. I flipped around in it, and I kind of liked what he was saying. I thought that would be helpful both for my library instruction and me as somebody who loves literature and obviously thinks about it. And then I picked up Writing Creative Nonfiction, Instruction and Insights from the Teachers of the Associated Writing Programs. This is edited by Carolyn Forsch and Philip Gerard. And they have exercises at the end of each essay. And just flipping through it, I really like some of the exercises. So I thought I'll try that.
One of the things that's really cool about the Montague Book Mill is there's all these little cozy nooks and crannies and rooms. And so Chris and I were upstairs, and there's a section for writing, and that's where she found a couple of those.
Yeah, writing and then literary biography. Really neat sections, and it's a nice store in that it's not overstuffed.
Yeah.
Okay, we've only been there twice, but it's not overstuffed and things are well organized. Yeah. So it's a nice browsing experience.
It's not overwhelming at all. I really enjoy it.
And the food was good.
The food was really good and necessary because we were losing our energy before, and no one wants to lose energy before walking into a bookstore, I'll tell you.
That's for sure.
Or I should say no one wants to enter a bookstore without energy.
Yeah, so after we left the book mill, we drove back through Montague Center, which we've been in that area too before because you kind of drive right through it on your way to the book mill. But we stopped at the Montague Center Library. The last time we were there, it was closed, but it also wasn't very clear if it was a library.
And for some reason, we thought it was a restaurant.
I know, because there's a big industrial size vent on the side of it.
Okay.
And that was during the pandemic, because I remember we had masks on and stuff the last time.
Maybe it was just closed for the pandemic.
It could have been, right? Yeah. So it's the old town hall, and the library takes up the whole first floor. So it was really wonderful to get to go in there. They have pretty limited hours. There's another library in the area. But this one, I think it was open on Wednesday from 3 to 7 or something like that. So we actually got to go in and walk around and talk with the librarian a little bit.
Who told us it's the oldest building in Montague.
Yeah.
And it was a really cool setting.
And we did a Biblio Adventure video on our BookTube channel, actually, now that we say this. So if you want to see some stuff about our day, check that out.
We'll put a link in the show notes, and we actually film it with the Montague Library in the background.
Yes. So tell me about this Biblio Adventure that you went on without me.
I'm so sorry. Oh, guilt.
Oh, no. Guilt. No guilt at all.
She was working, people. It wasn't like she wasn't invited. Sometimes we do have to work. I went to RJ Julia's just down the street in Madison, Connecticut, to see Betsy Lerner in conversation with Roxanne Cody, who's the owner of RJ Julia's, to talk about Betsy's debut novel, Shred Sisters, which has a fantastic cover. Just show this to Chris.
It's amazing. Yeah. I mean, sisters that are so different.
Yeah. It's like a face that's split in half, and one has long dark hair and tulips, and the other has like a short blonde bob and cacti coming out of their face. So just to give you a little insight. It was funny because if you've heard the name Betsy Lerner, it's because she's pretty well known as being an editor and a literary agent, and she's written several works of nonfiction, including a couple memoirs and a writing book, which I talked about on the last episode. So go to episode 218 show notes if you want to see what those books are. At the very beginning of this conversation, and Roxanne and Betsy are friends who breakfast together, so they were very at ease with each other. Betsy talks about how she does not represent novelists because she doesn't like fiction writers. And lo and behold, now she is one. And she tells the story of it being the pandemic. And she was watching Inception with her husband and her daughter, and she couldn't follow the story at all. It is a complicated movie, the premise of it is. And so she opened up her laptop thinking she was just going to answer emails or something, and this novel started to pour out of her. And it only took her 7 months to write it, and then 2 years of revision. But the premise of it is that years prior to the pandemic, I think just a year or two, there was a tragedy in her family where her sister's 2 children, so Betsy's niece and nephew, were killed by a drunk driver in a car accident. And so the sister was having trouble getting out of bed, as you might imagine. So Betsy and her other sister took turns going to visit, to just spend like 3 weeks at a time with her and check on her mental health. And then the pandemic came and they couldn't do it. So they started to meet via FaceTime to work out together. Like they would just call each other via FaceTime, go on YouTube, find a workout video, and just do it together. And then they started to joke that they were shredding with each other, which for most people, like that term means you're like ripping up your muscles and lifting heavy weights and then spending a couple of days rebuilding your muscles. Or some people shred on bikes and stuff like that. So for them, it was in jest, and then they would put it on their calendars. What time should we shred? Thus the title, The Shred Sisters, right? She admits that it is semi-autobiographical and that she's every character in the book, which I thought was very brave to admit. And she told this story. She has 2 sisters. One is older, one is younger. So Betsy's the middle child, and their younger sister is much younger. So she and her older sister were already adults and out of the house, and they had a falling out. And their younger sister called them on it. This was years ago, and said, "You're really messing up the family and making it uncomfortable." So Betsy and her older sister decided to go to therapy. And when they went to therapy one time, they only went once, the therapist had given them homework before they arrived saying, write down 10 things you love about each other and 10 things you hate about each other. They did it separately. And when they went and shared this information, they noticed that they balanced each other. So for example, Betsy, who's the younger of the 2, said, all I want is to look up to you. And her older sister said, all I want is for you to admire and look up to me. So it was a very important process that they went to, and that she said it didn't heal everything about their relationship, but it allowed them to be in a room together and go back for Thanksgiving and that sort of thing. So those are the sorts of things that informed this novel that poured out of her. She never thought she would be writing a novel about sisters, and there you have it. The other thing that I thought I would mention is that Betsy has become a TikTok star. She started off on TikTok just talking about being a literary agent, and one of her friends was like, yeah, if you want to get traction, you need to figure out something else to do. So she went into her office one day and saw this shelf of journals that she has, and she started to read parts of her journals on TikTok, and the first one went viral.
Wow.
And she has 20,000 followers on TikTok and reads her journal, or some people call it book talk, same thing. And it really reinvigorated her. Her books are selling, and she said there are these young people on Book Talk holding up The Shred Sisters, her new novel. So it's been a really fun thing for her. She did also talk about, one of her memoirs is about her struggles with mental illness as a young 20-something. And so that is something that's part of Shred Sisters. I think that that is one of the things that people are finding very appealing about her on Book Talk, is that she's sharing these journals that are about that time in her life when she was really struggling. And she doesn't hesitate in this novel to also talk about how sometimes people who are mentally ill can be very manipulative. And she's speaking from experience. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited to start the novel. I have it in my hands. I haven't started it yet. Again, it's called Shred Sisters by Betsy Lerner, and she's on Book Tour now. So look her up, and she's on Book Talk. Find her.
Very cool. So what about upcoming jaunts?
We're going on a joint jaunt to New York City this weekend to see Aunt Ellen.
We are.
Super excited. We know where we're starting the day, which is not a bookstore or a library, yes. But we're hoping to find some.
Yeah, we're going to be spontaneous and see what happens. If nothing happens, we're just going to walk around and talk.
It's supposed to be a beautiful day.
Yes. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
And then on October 27th at Breakwater Books, which is our local bookstore right in Guilford,
Penny Gochin is going to be there from 1 to 3 that day signing books. Her latest is out, and we're hoping to be able to stop by. We don't know yet what our schedule is that weekend, but that's our plan.
Yes, and her novel is called Deadly Ripples.
Yes.
Dun, 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 dun.
October 30th, you and I are heading up to Massachusetts again. This time the other side of the state. We're going to Concord for a Margaret Fuller event.
Yes, looking forward to that.
At the Concord Library. Because there's a new Library of America edition of her collected works coming out. It's going to have some of her nonfiction, fiction, letters, reviews that she wrote for the newspaper, dispatches from Italy. It's going to have a little bit of everything. And so I'm going to do a buddy read of that with whoever'd like to join me. The book comes out in February, last I heard. And so at this event, we're going to learn a little bit more about the book, because it's an event with the editors. So I'm thinking we'll probably start in March, so everybody gets time to acquire a copy of the book, and then we'll take it from there.
Yes, looking forward to that. And how about upcoming reads?
Well, on the way over here to Book Cougars headquarters, I stopped and picked up a book on hold. It is Read Between the Lines by Rachel Lacey. This is a sapphic romance, at the center of which is a Manhattan bookstore. Yes. One of the characters is running what was her mom's bookstore in Manhattan, and then the love interest's family cancels the lease on the building. So their budding romance takes a turn. So looking forward to this. I saw reviews of it, and I put it on hold immediately because I thought it sounded like something I might enjoy. I really enjoy stories set in bookstores or around the publishing industry. They're so meta in that way.
Ooh, that could be a future read-along theme. I mean, we did books about books, but we didn't do books with bookstores in them.
We could do books set in bookstores or in the publishing industry.
I mean, this one, Deadly Romantics, is... there's a bookstore.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, I, too, stopped at a library and picked up a book that was on hold for me. And it's a book that I've been waiting for a really long time. It's called What to Cook When You Don't Feel Like Cooking by Carolyn Chambers, who goes by Caro, C-A-R-O, in the Mediaverse. And this is a woman who was working in the field of recipe testing for other companies when the pandemic came and her career kind of dried up. And so she started to get on Instagram and post, "What's in your refrigerator? Tell me what's there and I'll tell you what to cook." And she just took off. People started following her. She started a Substack newsletter called What to Cook When You Don't Feel Like Cooking, where one day on the weekend she would put out the newsletter that had ideas about what to cook in the coming week. And she now has the #1 food Substack. And this is her newest cookbook. And I cannot wait to read it.
Nice. That sounds like my life. What to cook when you don't feel like cooking.
I mean,
That's
I
great.
think a lot of people suffer from that. I always want to cook. I don't always want to think about what to cook. I want people to say, "Hey, will you make," I just turned to, "crunchy refried bean tacodillas?" Yes, I will. I will happily spend the entire day in the kitchen. I just don't want to always think about what to make. I love that. And she's one of those people, too. Her recipes are like, okay, this is a recipe for halibut. If you don't have halibut, you can use chicken. She does a lot of that substitute stuff,
That's
which
great.
I really appreciate.
Yeah. Beautiful pictures in that.
Yes.
That made me hungry, you flipping through it just now.
I'm sorry. We're both hungry. And then on the train down to New York, we both are going to be reading Murder in the Smithsonian by Margaret Truman. This is our buddy read that we're doing with our mystery man, John Valeri.
Yes, that'll be coming up on a future episode, our conversation with John about this novel.
I think that's it, everybody.
That is it. Another episode in the bag, as they say.
On episode 220, we will be hosting a giveaway because we do that on every 10th episode. If you are not on our email newsletter list, please join it. We send an email at the end of every month. And if you are on our email newsletter list, you are automatically entered to win. And we would love to have you.
Absolutely.
That information is in the show notes. But what we also would like is for you to register to vote. And vote, please.
Vote. Early voting starts in Connecticut on the 21st of October. It's the first time our state is doing early voting. And I plan on being there when they open.
Happy reading.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.